But you see, this tends to give us the impression that our world is a lot of bits, and that things are really separate from each other. You see, how could I demonstrate how this is? I have an idea. Mr. Cameraman, will you focus the camera on one small, tiny spot in the set and come very close to it and travel along bit by bit by bit by bit. Now you see, this is looking at the world little bit by little bit, as if we were only using the central vision of our eyes, the kind of vision we use for reading and close work of that kind. But if this were the only way we had of looking at things, it would be very difficult to make any sense of life at all, because we would see everything in series, bit after bit after bit. But fortunately, we are also able to enlarge the whole view and take in everything at once in a single sweep. And you see, this shows all the advantages and the disadvantages of looking at things in the way that Indian philosophy calls Maya. Because if Maya were the only way we had for looking at things, we should only be able to understand one thing at a time. And our world is not just one thing happening, one after another, one at a time. Our world is an enormous volume, a great vastness, in which everything is happening all together at once. Now, being able to think of things one at a time is extraordinarily useful, because this is what enables us to have science, to have scientific control of nature, to be able to count things, measure them, manage them, and predict their behavior in the future. But it is inclined to run away with us and give us the impression, if we think too hard about things, or if we put too much faith in thinking, that the world is made up of a lot of separate bits, so that we have a kind of bit-by-bit approach to nature, what I might call a putt-putt-putt-putt view of life. It's useful, indeed, to break things down into things and to classify them. But the moment it gives us the impression that these little bits into which we have divided the world are really and in nature separate from each other, we get into confusion. Now, how do we know that divided things aren't really separate? Look, for example, at me. How do you know I'm here? How can you make out the outlines of my body? Isn't it because there is a contrast between the background behind me and my figure? You know where the background ends and I begin, and so you are able to see me. But now, what would happen if the background should vanish and disappear, and I would no longer be there, but the figure in the ground instead would be my button? In order to see me, you have to see a background along with me. And so, if we go back and look again at the whole thing, then we can see once again. Now, what does that tell us? Surely, the thing that it tells us is not merely that the background is one thing and the figure is another. Since the two must go together, it indicates that there is a connection between them. If you can't have the perception of a figure without a background, if you simply cannot see it if there is no background there, doesn't that mean that the background and the figure are some way inseparable? They're different, yes, but they're inseparable differences. Take, for example, a coin. When you have a coin, it has two sides, heads and tails. And these two sides are indeed different. You might say they are separate sides. But what would happen if we take a file and start rubbing away to get rid of one of the sides? Well, we would rub and rub and rub, and when we finally got rid of the side, the other side would have vanished too. because the two sides of a coin go together. Yes, they are different, but they are also inseparable. And this is true of almost everything in the world, because we distinguish things from their background. We distinguish one side from another as we distinguish up from down. Now imagine what would happen if we arranged everything in this set, or tried to arrange everything, so that nothing were down, everything had to be up. If we could really, in nature, separate the up from the down, why, we couldn't do it. Because up goes with down, is unintelligible apart from down, in the same way that the head side of a coin goes together with the tail side. And so in this way, we as individuals, as separate beings, are really inseparable from the whole natural environment in which we live. We go together, and you cannot have the one without the other. Without what we call things, there would be no world. But without what we would call the whole world, there would be no things. And this is not only true of what we call things and objects. It's also true of many of our experiences. Let's take, for example, one of the most fundamental distinctions in experience, what is pleasant and what is not. Now, a great many people are bending the whole effort of their lives to have pleasure and get rid of pain. This pursuit of pleasure is regarded as the fundamental aim of human existence. And you know, when you start to read old books on Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, they very often say that the first thing a man must understand is to give up the pursuit of pleasure. And people who read these things think that these are very gripey Puritans, people who have a sour attitude to life, who burnt their fingers in the game of the pursuit of pleasure and say, well, let's not get mixed up with that anymore. But as a matter of fact, this is just a plain, clear, sensible statement. It's like saying, you cannot have up without down. You cannot have a figure without a background. And in the same way exactly, you cannot experience pleasure unless there is something with which you can contrast it. You know what happens when a person who's longed to make a great deal of money all his life, and he makes it. Finally he gets $1 million. And he thinks this is the answer. Well, it's fine, just in the moment of transition, while he's going from poverty to richness. But when he's had his $1 million for a few months, everything adjusts itself. And he begins to feel just the same as he always felt before. Conversely, if some of you have lived near a tannery or near a public utility place like a gas-producing factory, you get so used to the bad smell in the background that you cease to notice it. It becomes the normal smell. And so you don't notice it anymore as a bad smell. For both the bad and the good need each other as contrasts. And therefore, when we try to get rid of one of the pairs and possess the other only, we do something that is profoundly nonsensical. We think we can do it because in Maya, that is to say, in conventional thinking, in terms of that kind of measurement that we call thought, we can separate the one from the other. We can talk about up as different from down. We can talk about one thing as different from other things. But in actual experience, it can't be done. Just as in actual experience, that wiggly line was a continuous line and not a series of points. And in another way, too, we can't really pursue pleasure because pleasure is something that has to come to us. For example, you can pursue a cow, and you can go out and catch it and kill it and serve it up as steak. That you can do. But you can't pursue the pleasure that you get from eating steak. If, in other words, you try to get pleasure out of steak, supposing I sit here and I have a great big splendid steak served to me, and I say, this is the best steak I ever ate, why, it's a Chateaubriand, and it costs $12 a plate, and therefore I must make the very maximum effort to enjoy it, and I cut the thing up, and I put it in my mouth, and say, now, I've really got to get the most out of this piece of steak. And so I chew it with all my might to get the very best out of it. And what happens? I'm making so much muscular strain, I'm trying so hard to get something out of it, that I frustrate the very pleasure that it should give. Why is that? Surely it is because pleasure is a function of nerves, and you can't make an effort with your nerves. Catching a cow is a function of muscles, and you can make an effort with your muscles. To give another illustration of the same thing, supposing I want to see an object in the far distance. I want to make out the time on a distant clock. Now my eyes are nervous rather than muscular. And if I strain my eyes very hard to make out what is way off on the clock in the distance, what happens? All the images of the figures on the clock go fuzzy. But if I relax my eyes and let the image come to it, as light does in fact come to the eyes, then I can see the image clearly. So, when we think of the world as consisting primarily of a lot of disconnected things, and ourselves as one of them, so that we go out and get those things, or we can push those things around to suit ourselves, we forget so easily that the entire system of nature, ourselves included, is interconnected in every conceivable way. You know what happens when you think, well, we've got a lot of mosquitoes around here, all kinds of insects that bite us and bother us. Let's get rid of them. So we bring in the DDT and we send an aeroplane over and spray the whole surrounding territory with DDT. And what happens? Suddenly we find that other insects or other pests which those insects we destroyed were feeding upon multiply and increase, and we have a new problem. We have to get rid of those. It's like when they brought rabbits into Australia because they thought they'd be useful there for some reason or other. The rabbits multiplied because there was nothing that fed on rabbits. Then they had a plague of rabbits. You see, you cannot just push nature around. You cannot regard it as something to be attacked so that you can grab bits from it and shove it around any old way as if it were a machine that you could bang around like a mechanic. Indeed, even machines, as any good mechanic knows, are not that simple to play with. But if we do not see that our view of the separateness of the world is based on a convention of thinking, it exists, as it were, in here. It doesn't exist out here in actual concrete reality. And if we are confused, then we jump to follow our thoughts instead of our senses, and this is no sense.